Why was she the only one standing when 12 Marines lay sprawled in the dirt? The question hung in the Arizona desert air like smoke after a firefight. But to understand that moment, to really understand what happened when Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers faced down an entire squad with 3 fractured ribs and blood seeping from her split lip, you have to go back 6 hours earlier. Back to when the transport truck rattled across the wasteland at 600, carrying her toward a place that would either forge her into something unbreakable or destroy her completely. Camp Sentinel sat in the middle of nowhere for a reason. The kind of reason that military bureaucrats don't write down in official documents. It wasn't on most maps, didn't appear in recruitment brochures, wasn't the kind of place they sent Marines who were looking for an easy assignment or a comfortable bed. This was where they sent people to discover their breaking point, or shatter completely trying. The desert sun hadn't fully risen yet, but already the heat was climbing. The kind of heat that made the sand shimmer like liquid silver, that turned air into something thick enough to chew. Jordan stepped off that truck with her desert camouflage already dark with sweat, her regulation bun pulled so tight it hadn't shifted despite 3 hours of bone-rattling travel through hell. She moved with a precision that couldn't be taught in classrooms or learned from manuals. 2 combat tour in Afghanistan. A Bronze Star for valor, a reputation built on blood and determination. But none of that mattered here. At Sentinel, reputation was just noise until you proved it in the dirt. And the man who decided who proved what was Drill Instructor Sergeant Marcus Blake, a human sledgehammer wrapped in Marine Corps green who'd been breaking recruits and crushing dreams for 8 years straight. He stood at the edge of the main training pit like a monument to controlled violence, arms crossed, voice carrying across the compound like thunder. "Listen up, meat puppets," his words cut through the morning heat. "You think you're Marines because you survived basic. You think you're hard because you got through infantry training. You're nothing. You're less than nothing. You're mistakes that somebody forgot to flush." 12 Marines stood at attention in that blazing sun, stone-faced, sweat-soaked. These weren't fresh recruits with soft hands and softer spines. These were hardened infantry Marines with combat experience, men who'd seen real fire and lived to tell about it. But under Blake's glare, they looked like terrified children trying not to wet themselves. Jordan moved to join the formation, her boots crunching on sun-baked earth. Every eye tracked her movement, not because she was the only woman, though she was, but because she carried herself differently. No fear, no hesitation, just the calm confidence of someone who'd already walked through hell and come out smiling. Blake's eyes locked onto her like a predator spotting wounded prey. "Well, well, well, what do we have here? Somebody sent us a secretary by mistake." His voice dripped with contempt that could corrode steel. "This is advanced combat training, sweetheart, not a typing pool." Jordan didn't flinch, didn't react, just maintained her position of attention, her gray eyes cold as winter mountain streams, fixed straight ahead. She'd heard it all before, in basic training, in infantry school, in the desert camps of Helmand Province. Words were just air unless you let them become something more. "You got something to say, Staff Sergeant?" Blake stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "Ready to train, Drill Instructor." Her voice was steady as bedrock, same as everyone else. Blake's laugh sounded like gravel being poured into a cement mixer. "Same as everyone else. Princess, you ain't the same as anyone here. These men are warriors. You're—" He paused, looking her up and down like she was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. "You're an experiment that's about to fail." The other Marines shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Jordan and Blake. They'd all heard stories about women trying to make it through advanced training. They'd also heard stories about what happened to the ones who didn't know when to quit. Jordan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, almost, but she said nothing, just absorbed the words like armor-absorbing bullets. She'd learned long ago that the loudest person in the room was usually the most afraid, and fear made people dangerous in unpredictable ways. "All right, ladies," Blake bellowed, turning back to address the formation. Today we're going to separate the sharks from the guppies. Combat conditioning, full contact, no safety gear, no time limits, no mercy. Last person standing gets chow first. Everyone else eats dirt. He pointed at Jordan with one thick finger. And since our little visitor here thinks she belongs, she gets to go first, against all of them. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Let's see how long this experiment lasts in the real world. The training pit fell silent except for the whisper of desert wind across sand and the distant rumble of jets practicing overhead maneuvers. 12 Marines looked at Jordan with expressions ranging from pity to anticipation. None of them looked away. Jordan stepped forward, rolling her shoulders once, her hands relaxed at her sides. She'd been here before. Not this exact place, but this exact moment. The moment when everything hung in balance, when choices made in seconds would echo for years. But there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. Something about the way Blake's eyes tracked her movements. Something about the deliberate cruelty in his voice that went beyond standard drill instructor intimidation. This wasn't about training. This was personal in a way she didn't fully understand, and that made it far more dangerous than any combat exercise. In the distance, a buzzard circled overhead, riding the thermals with patient grace. Even the scavengers knew something was about to go very wrong, or very right, depending on whose side you were on. What happens when you realize the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from? The barracks at Camp Sentinel weren't built for comfort. Concrete walls that wept condensation in the desert heat, metal bunks that creaked like old bones, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps 24 hours a day. The air conditioning had given up sometime during the Clinton administration, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Jordan dropped her duffel on the narrow bunk assigned to her, the sound echoing through the nearly empty building like a gunshot. The other Marines had already claimed their territories, spreading out their gear with the territorial efficiency of people marking boundaries. She could feel their eyes on her back, watching, waiting, judging. She didn't blame them for the wariness. In their position, she'd have felt the same way. Change was uncomfortable. Change you didn't ask for was worse. And a female staff sergeant assigned to advanced combat training. That was change that challenged everything they thought they knew about their world. "Yo, new girl." The voice came from a bunk 3 rows down. A massive Marine with shoulders like granite slabs and a scar running from his left eyebrow into his hairline. "That your real rack number, or did somebody screw up the roster?" Jordan turned slowly, meeting his eyes without hostility, without fear. "Staff Sergeant Rivers, and the roster's correct." "Peterson," he nodded once. "They call me Hammer." Of course they did. He looked like he could drive railroad spikes with his forehead. "Good to meet you, Peterson." "We'll see about that." It wasn't quite a threat, more like a promise, like he was telling her that judgment was coming and she'd better be ready for it. The first week at Sentinel was designed to break spirits before it broke bodies. Wake up at 400, 20-mile runs in full gear through the desert. Obstacle courses that seemed specifically engineered to find your weakest point and exploit it until something tore or fractured or gave up completely. Hand-to-hand combat drills that left everyone bleeding and bruised and questioning their life choices. Jordan kept pace with the men, sometimes ahead of them, never asking for quarter, never expecting special treatment. She'd learned early in her career that respect had to be earned in the same currency everyone else paid: sweat, blood, and the refusal to quit when quitting would be easier. But Blake watched her differently than he watched the others. There was a specific kind of attention in his gaze, the way a hunter watches prey, the way someone studies a problem they're planning to solve with violence. On the third day, during close-quarters combat training, Blake paired her against Peterson, the massive Marine who outweighed her by 80 pounds and had arms like tree trunks. "Let's see what you got, Staff Sergeant," Blake said, his voice carrying that edge of anticipation. like he was waiting for something specific to happen. "Show us if you belong." Peterson moved into the circle with professional courtesy, his stance balanced, his eyes respectful. This wasn't personal for him, just another drill, just another training evolution. The fight lasted 90 seconds. Jordan used his size against him, slipping inside his reach, targeting pressure points and joints, moving with a speed that came from fighting smaller opponents in close quarters for years. When Peterson hit the mat for the third time, breathing hard, Blake's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering. "Lucky," he muttered, "let's see you do it again." She did it again, and again, against different opponents, different styles, different challenges, and each time she walked out of that circle still standing, Blake's jaw got tighter, his instructions got harsher, his attention got more focused. The other Marines started to notice, started to whisper during evening downtime. Jackson, a lean sergeant with quick eyes and quicker hands, approached her one night in the mess hall. "You should watch yourself, Rivers." He kept his voice low, his eyes scanning to make sure Blake wasn't within earshot. "He's got it out for you, and when Blake decides someone doesn't belong, he makes damn sure they don't last." Noted. Jordan didn't look up from her meal, didn't show the cold not forming in her stomach. "Thanks for the heads up." "I'm serious. Last woman who came through here lasted 3 days before she requested transfer. Said she fell during obstacle course training, but everyone knew Blake had arranged for her to fall, just like he'd arranged for her to fail every physical test, just like he'd made sure she understood she wasn't wanted here." Jordan set down her fork, meeting Jackson's eyes directly. "I'm not her." "I know, that's what worries me." He stood, picking up his tray. "Blake doesn't like being challenged, and you just existing here, that's challenge enough." That night, lying on her bunk in the suffocating heat, Jordan stared at the ceiling and thought about choices. About how you could do everything right and still end up in situations where right didn't matter. About how systems designed to protect could become systems that destroyed. About how sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't across some distant border. It was standing right in front of you wearing the same uniform. She'd faced insurgents in Helmand, survived firefights that should have killed her, carried wounded teammates through enemy territory while bullets snapped past her head. But somehow, lying in this barracks surrounded by fellow Marines, she felt more vulnerable than she'd ever felt in combat. Because in combat, you knew who the enemy was. The rules were clear, even if they were brutal. But here the rules kept shifting. Here the enemy wore friendly uniforms and spoke in official language and used the system itself as a weapon. But there was something Blake didn't know about her. Something the official records didn't capture and the stories didn't tell. Jordan Rivers had grown up fighting, not in training gyms or controlled environments. On the streets of Detroit, where survival meant learning to read violence before it exploded, where understanding predators wasn't optional, it was the price of making it to 18 alive. She'd seen Blake's type before, men who needed to dominate to feel strong, who confused cruelty with toughness, who believed that breaking others somehow proved they couldn't be broken themselves. And she knew exactly how they thought, exactly how they moved, exactly where their weakness hid beneath all that rage and posturing. In the darkness, she smiled, not with joy, with recognition, with the cold certainty of someone who'd already decided how this story would end. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the sand like voices from the past, carrying promises of storms to come. How much can you endure before you break? And what if breaking is exactly what they need you to do? The fourth week at Camp Sentinel brought the kind of heat that made rational thought difficult. The kind that turned metal into brands and sand into something that burned through boot soles. The kind that made you question why humans had ever decided to build anything in the desert except maybe warning signs telling people to turn around. Blake ramped up the intensity. Longer runs, harder obstacles, combat drills that seemed designed less for training and more for injury. The other Marines were struggling, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their movements sluggish with heat and fatigue. But Jordan kept pace, stayed focused, refused to give Blake the satisfaction of seeing her falter. It was driving him insane. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched when she completed an obstacle course ahead of half the men, in the way his eyes narrowed when she outshot everyone on the range, in the way his fists tightened when she helped Peterson up after a particularly brutal grappling session, showing him the technique she'd used so he could counter it next time. That's what Blake couldn't stand, she realized. Not just that she was succeeding, but that she was building camaraderie, earning respect, becoming part of the unit instead of being isolated and ejected like he'd planned. The Marines were starting to see her as one of them, and that made her dangerous in a way Blake couldn't tolerate. On Thursday of the fourth week, during an advanced tactical drill, Blake made his move. The scenario was simple: clear a hostile building, neutralize targets, extract a high-value package. Standard close quarters battle training they'd all run 100 times. Jordan was assigned point position, leading the entry team. She moved through the mock structure with practiced efficiency, her rifle tracking corners, her movements fluid and controlled. Behind her, Jackson and two others followed in tight formation. Everything by the book, everything professional. But when they hit the third room, something felt wrong. The training rounds they were supposed to be using made a specific sound. Light, controlled. These rounds sounded different, heavier, and when one caught her in the ribs, the pain wasn't the dull thud of rubber training ammunition. It was sharp, immediate, the kind of pain that meant something had fractured. Jordan went down hard, her breath exploding from her lungs, her vision going white with agony. Through the haze, she heard Blake's voice over the radio. "What's wrong, Staff Sergeant? Can't handle a little contact." She tried to breathe, couldn't, tried to stand. Her ribs screamed in protest, each breath feeling like shattered glass piercing her lungs. Someone had switched the ammunition. Someone had turned a training exercise into something that could cause real damage. And Blake's voice over the radio told her exactly who that someone was. "Exercise terminated," Blake called out. "Rivers is compromised. Medical evaluation required." Jackson helped her to her feet, his face pale, his eyes wide with understanding. "Those weren't training rounds," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, those weren't training rounds." The medic, a young corpsman who looked terrified, examined her ribs with gentle but thorough hands. "3 fractures, ma'am. You need to go to the base hospital. This is serious." "I'm fine." Jordan's voice came out through gritted teeth. "Just tape them up." "Staff Sergeant, you need actual medical care. Fractured ribs can puncture lungs. You could." "Tape them up." She met his eyes with such intensity that he actually took a step back. Blake appeared in the doorway of the medical tent, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed with something that might have been satisfaction. "Tough luck, Rivers. These things happen in training. Maybe you should take some recovery time. Head back to your old unit. No shame in it." There it was, the offer disguised as concern, the escape hatch he was giving her. Take the injury, accept defeat, leave quietly, let him win without having to destroy her completely. Jordan stood slowly, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through her torso. The corpsman had wrapped her ribs tight enough to restrict breathing, tight enough to provide some stability, but she could feel the grinding sensation with every breath, could taste blood from where she'd bitten her lip when she hit the ground. "I'm not going anywhere, drill instructor." Her voice was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that came before violence. "I'm here to complete training." Blake's mask slipped for just a second. Behind the professional neutrality, she saw pure rage. "You sure about that, Staff Sergeant? Because I'd hate for you to get hurt worse. Training's about to get real intense." "I'm sure." That night, lying in her bunk with her ribs screaming and her breath coming in shallow gasps, Jordan understood exactly what was coming. Blake had escalated, crossed a line that should never be crossed, and now he was committed. He couldn't back down without admitting what he'd done. Couldn't let her succeed without exposing himself as someone who'd deliberately injured a Marine under his command. He had to break her, completely, in front of everyone, in a way that looked like legitimate training so nobody could question it. Peterson sat down on the bunk across from her, his massive frame making the metal groan in protest. "You need to report this. What happened today wasn't an accident." "I know." "So report it, go to the commanding officer, file a complaint. This is assault, Rivers, this is criminal." She shook her head slowly, even though the movement made her want to vomit from pain. "Reports take time. Investigations take longer. And while they're investigating, Blake destroys everyone who cooperated with me. Everyone who treated me like I belonged here. You think he won't make your lives hell if I file complaints?" Peterson was quiet for a long moment. "So what do you do?" "I finish what I started." Jordan met his eyes. "And I make sure Blake understands that some people can't be broken, no matter what he does." "That's suicide." "Maybe," she smiled, even though it hurt. "Or maybe it's the only way to stop him from doing this to the next woman, or the next Marine who doesn't fit his idea of what belongs here." Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the barracks windows like bones in a box. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, lonely and defiant. Jordan closed her eyes, breathing through the pain, preparing herself for what was coming. Because she knew Blake wasn't done, not even close. He was just getting started. And so was she. What do you do when the system designed to protect you becomes the weapon used against you? Friday morning dawned hotter than hell and twice as unforgiving. Jordan woke before the alarm, her ribs a symphony of agony with every shallow breath. The painkillers the corpsman had given her sat untouched in her locker. She needed to feel this, needed to understand exactly how compromised she was, because you couldn't fight effectively if you didn't know your own limitations. She taped her ribs tighter than the medic had, tight enough that breathing was work, tight enough that she could barely bend, but tight enough that the fractured bones had some stability, some protection against the impact she knew was coming. Formation at 500. Blake stood at the head of the training pit with an expression that might have been concern on someone who possessed human emotions, but on his face it looked like anticipation poorly disguised. "Morning, Marines, today's exercise is combat readiness assessment, full contact, multiple opponents, real-world scenario simulation." His eyes found Jordan in the formation. "Staff Sergeant Rivers, since you're still with us despite yesterday's unfortunate accident, you'll be going first, against the entire squad." The silence that followed was absolute. 12 Marines stood in that formation, and every single one of them understood what was happening. This wasn't training. This was orchestrated destruction. This was Blake using official channels to do what he couldn't do legally, eliminate someone who challenged his authority simply by existing. Jackson's voice cut through the silence. "Drill instructor, that's not standard protocol. 1 versus 12 isn't combat readiness. That's—" "Did I ask for your opinion, Sergeant?" Blake's voice could have frozen fire. "You questioning my authority?" Jackson's jaw worked, but he fell silent. They all knew the math. Question Blake, get written up. Get written up enough times, lose rank. Lose rank, lose career. The system protected people like Blake because people like Blake knew exactly how to use the system. Jordan stepped forward before anyone else could speak, before anyone else could risk their career trying to protect her. "I'm ready, drill instructor." Blake's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Good. Rules are simple. Survive or tap out. No permanent damage, no killing blows, but everything else." He shrugged. "Combat doesn't follow safety regulations." She walked to the center of the pit while the 12 Marines formed a circle around her. These weren't strangers anymore. Over the past month she'd trained with them, bled with them, learned their strengths and their weaknesses. Peterson with his overwhelming power, Jackson with his speed, Martinez with his grappling expertise. They looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to anger. None of them wanted to do this. All of them knew they had to, because Blake was watching, because the system demanded obedience, because sometimes good people did terrible things because the alternative was worse. "Finish her off," Blake said quietly. 3 words that hung in the desert air like a death sentence. The first Marine moved in, Thompson, cautious, telegraphing his strikes because he didn't want to hurt her worse than necessary. Jordan slipped his punch, drove her elbow into his solar plexus, and dropped him with a knee strike that was more mercy than malice. Fast, clean, before her ribs could scream too loud. The second came faster. Davis, not pulling punches now, understanding that hesitation would only prolong this. She took the hit on her shoulder, turned into it, used his momentum to throw him into Martinez, who was moving in from the left. 2 down, 10 to go. Her ribs were on fire. Every breath was agony. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her torso. But she kept moving, kept fighting. Because stopping meant Blake won. Stopping meant every woman who came after her would face the same systematic destruction. Stopping meant the system that enabled this would continue unchallenged. Peterson came in low and hard, not out of malice but out of professional respect, fighting her like she was dangerous, like she deserved his best effort. She caught his arm, hyperextended his elbow just enough to make him drop, whispered, "I'm sorry," as she kicked his legs out from under him. 3 down. Jackson moved like water, his strikes precise and professional. She traded blows with him, taking hits that made her vision blur, landing strikes that she knew would bruise for weeks. They danced that violent dance of combat while the desert sun climbed higher and Blake's expression grew darker. When Jackson hit the dirt, breathing hard, respect clear in his eyes, Jordan felt something crack. Not her ribs, those had been cracked since yesterday. Something deeper. The understanding that she was going to make it through this. Not unscathed, not undamaged, but unbroken. The remaining Marines came at her in waves, coordinated now, understanding that individual attacks wouldn't work against someone who'd fought for survival in places where mistakes meant death. She used their coordination against them, turned their teamwork into obstacles, made them trip over each other while she stayed mobile despite ribs that screamed with every movement. Martinez went down with a choke hold that put him to sleep gently. Williams caught an elbow that sent him sprawling. Chen and Rodriguez tangled with each other when she sidestepped their synchronized attack. And through it all, Blake's face grew darker, angrier, more desperate, because his plan was failing. His orchestrated destruction was becoming her triumph, and everyone watching could see it. The last Marine standing was Morrison, a quiet kid from Ohio who'd barely spoken 3 words the entire month. He looked at Jordan with something that might have been awe mixed with apology, then deliberately stepped back, dropped his hands, refused to continue. "Drill instructor," Morrison said clearly. "This isn't training, I'm done." The silence that followed was deafening. Jordan stood in the center of that pit, surrounded by sprawled Marines, her breath coming in ragged gasps, blood seeping from her split lip, ribs screaming with every movement. But standing, still standing. Blake's face had gone purple with rage. "You think you've won something here, Rivers? You think this proves anything?" She looked at him with eyes cold as January wind, and when she spoke, her voice carried across that training pit with absolute clarity, absolute finality. "It proves that you can't break someone who refuses to be broken. It proves that your kind of leadership is finished. And it proves that I belong here just as much as any of them. Maybe more." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Because unlike you, drill instructor, I don't need to destroy people to feel strong." The Marines around her started getting to their feet, slowly, painfully, but none of them looked defeated. None of them looked broken. They looked like people who just witnessed something that changed how they understood the world. Jackson spoke first. "She's right." His voice was quiet but firm. "This wasn't training. This was attempted assault disguised as military exercise, and we all just participated in it." Peterson nodded, his massive frame unfolding from the dirt. "I'm filing a report, whatever the consequences." One by one, the other Marines voiced agreement, a chorus of voices that had found courage in Jordan's refusal to quit, in her willingness to stand alone against a system designed to crush her. Blake's authority, built on fear and intimidation and systematic abuse disguised as military tradition, crumbled in that moment. Because the Marines he'd commanded through terror had finally seen an alternative, had finally witnessed leadership that elevated instead of destroyed, had finally understood that true strength didn't come from breaking others, it came from refusing to be broken yourself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak loudly, doesn't make grand declarations or deliver stirring speeches. Sometimes dignity is simply standing up when everyone expects you to stay down, simply surviving when survival itself is an act of rebellion, simply being present when your very presence challenges everything wrong with a broken system. What happens after you've proven yourself unbreakable? The investigation that followed Jordan's confrontation with Blake moved with the speed of military bureaucracy, which is to say, like molasses flowing uphill in January. But this time, the delay worked in favor of justice rather than enabling abuse. Because 12 Marines filing identical reports about unauthorized use of live ammunition during training exercises, followed by orchestrated assault disguised as combat readiness assessment, created the kind of documentation that even institutional inertia couldn't ignore. Blake was removed from Camp Sentinel within 48 hours. Not discharged. The Marine Corps protected its own, even its worst, but reassigned to a desk position where his capacity to destroy lives was limited to paperwork and bureaucratic inefficiency. His career as a drill instructor, his identity as a man who broke recruits into Marines, ended the moment Jordan refused to break. The congressional inquiry came 3 months later. Jordan sat in a hearing room in Washington, D.C., wearing her dress blues with the bronze star gleaming on her chest, and told a room full of politicians exactly what had happened at Camp Sentinel. She didn't exaggerate, didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. "The system isn't broken," she testified, her voice clear and steady. "The system worked exactly as designed. It protected authority over accountability. It prioritized institutional reputation over individual welfare. It enabled systematic abuse because challenging that abuse required more courage than most people possess." She paused, meeting the eyes of the committee members. "The question isn't why I stood up. The question is why I had to stand alone for so long." The reforms that followed were named after her. The Rivers Protocol, mandatory independent oversight for advanced training facilities, anonymous reporting mechanisms that bypass chain of command, regular psychological evaluations for drill instructors to identify abusive behavior before it became systematic. But Jordan didn't stay in Washington to watch the bureaucracy implement change. She went back to where change was actually needed, to training facilities where young Marines were learning what it meant to wear the uniform. 6 months after Camp Sentinel, she stood in front of a new class at Advanced Combat Training Facility in California. 24 Marines stood at attention, their faces reflecting the nervous anticipation that always marked the beginning of serious training. Among them were faces she recognized from Sentinel: Jackson, Peterson, Morrison, others who'd witnessed what happened and requested transfer to her program. "This facility operates under different principles than what some of you experienced before," Jordan began, her voice carrying across the training area without shouting. "We're here to develop warriors, not to break spirits, not to prove who's toughest or meanest or most willing to inflict pain. We're here to build the kind of unshakable competence that keeps people alive when everything goes wrong." She walked along the front rank, making eye contact with each Marine in turn. Advanced combat training isn't about surviving abuse. It's about developing professional excellence. It's about building trust so complete that Marines will follow you into situations where following means almost certain death. You can't build that through fear or intimidation. You can only achieve it through mutual respect and leadership that elevates everyone around you. Peterson raised his hand. "Ma'am, permission to speak." "Granted." "Speaking for those of us from Camp Sentinel, we want you to know we understand what happened there was wrong. We were following orders, but that doesn't excuse our participation. We're here to learn how to be better Marines and better leaders." Jordan studied his face, seeing none of the casual arrogance that had marked their first encounter, none of the toxic confidence that had enabled systematic abuse under the guise of military tradition. "Sergeant Peterson, what happened at Camp Sentinel was the result of institutional failures that went far beyond individual choices. You were young Marines following orders from authority figures you'd been trained to trust." She paused, letting the words carry weight without seeming like a lecture. "But you're right about one thing. You have an opportunity here to learn something different. Not just about combat techniques, but about what leadership actually means when you're responsible for other people's lives." The training that followed was intense but professional, challenging but not destructive. They ran obstacle courses designed to test limits without breaking spirits, practiced combat scenarios that developed judgment under stress, learned to think independently while maintaining unit cohesion. And most importantly, they learned to recognize the difference between legitimate training and systematic abuse, to understand that questioning illegal orders wasn't weakness. It was the most important strength any Marine could possess. During a break between exercises, Jackson approached Jordan with careful steps. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "Why did you stay? After the ribs, after Blake made it clear he was going to destroy you, why didn't you just take the medical discharge and move on?" Jordan was quiet for a long moment, watching helicopters practice formations over the California hills. Because leaving meant Blake would do it to the next woman, or the next Marine who didn't fit his idea of what belonged. Someone had to stand up. Someone had to prove that the system could be challenged without being destroyed by it. "But you could have died. Those ribs could have punctured your lungs if Blake had gone further." Fear of what might happen is how people like Blake maintain power. Jordan met his eyes directly. "The moment you let fear of consequences stop you from doing what's right, you've already lost. You've already let the bullies win." Jackson nodded slowly. "Thank you for not losing." The story of Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers spread through the Marine Corps like wildfire. Not as a tale of impossible physical prowess, though 12 versus 1 with broken ribs made for compelling narrative, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought against foreign enemies. Sometimes they were fought against the failures within our own institutions. Young women entering the Marines heard her story and understood that they could belong, that their presence wasn't an experiment or a political statement. It was their right as warriors who'd earned the uniform. Young men heard her story and learned that true strength didn't come from dominating others. It came from the courage to stand up when standing up meant standing alone, from the willingness to challenge authority when authority was wrong. Drill instructors across the service heard her story and understood that their role wasn't to break recruits. It was to forge Marines through professional excellence rather than systematic abuse. And institutional leaders heard her story and finally found the courage to change systems that had been broken for generations, to choose excellence over cruelty, to honor the uniform through competence rather than violence. Years later, when Jordan retired from active service with the rank of colonel, her legacy lived on in every Marine who trained under the new system, in every leader who chose elevation over destruction, in every person who found courage to stand up when everyone else looked away. The lesson she taught wasn't complicated, wasn't mysterious, wasn't something that required special training or exceptional circumstances to understand. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. It stands when everyone expects you to fall. It continues when quitting would be easier. It refuses to be broken when breaking is exactly what the system demands. And in that refusal, in that simple act of standing up and staying up, it changes everything. The desert wind still blows across Camp Sentinel, now renamed Camp Rivers in her honor. The training pits remain, but the purpose has changed. Young Marines still face physical challenges that test their limits, still push themselves beyond what they thought possible, still discover strength they didn't know they possessed. But they do it in an environment that builds rather than destroys, that challenges rather than abuses, that forges warriors through professional excellence rather than systematic cruelty. And somewhere in Washington, in a dusty congressional archive, a testimony remains on record, words spoken by a woman who refused to be broken, challenging an institution that had protected abuse for too long. "The question isn't why I stood up," those words read. "The question is why I had to stand alone for so long." That question still echoes through the halls of power, still challenges institutions to do better, still reminds us that real change doesn't come from policies or protocols. It comes from individuals who possess the courage to stand up when standing up costs everything. Jordan Rivers didn't just survive Camp Sentinel. She transformed the very institution that tried to break her. Her legacy isn't measured in medals or promotions or congressional reforms, though those exist. Her legacy is measured in every Marine who trains without fear of systematic abuse, in every woman who knows she belongs, in every leader who chooses respect over intimidation, in every person who finds the courage to say no when everyone else stays silent. That legacy, written in blood and sand and unbreakable will, stands as testament to a simple truth that tyrants throughout history have tried to suppress. You cannot break someone who refuses to be broken. And when one person stands unbroken, they give others permission to stand as well, until what was once a solitary act of defiance becomes a movement, until what was once accepted as normal becomes recognized as unacceptable, until what was once a broken system becomes something worthy of the warriors it claims to forge. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And in acting, in that refusal to surrender to systems designed to crush the human spirit, it writes history one moment of unbreakable courage at a time.